47. American paratroopers walked into this jungle. 19 walked out, the rest swallowed by the green, dragged into tunnel networks so deep that recovery teams never found them. And you know what the Pentagon did? They drew a red line on the map and wrote 3 words. Off limits. Australians only. Wait, Australians? The guys from the country with more kangaroos than soldiers. Those Australians were allowed to go where United States Marines were forbidden to set foot. Oh, this story gets so much wilder than you think, because what those Aussie operators were doing in those mountains, the methods, the tactics, the things they left behind for the Viet Cong to find, were so effective and so disturbing that American liaison officers were requesting emergency transfers just to get away from them. One Marine sergeant came back from a joint patrol and submitted a 2-word report that got immediately classified. Those 2 words: "We're amateurs." You're about to discover why the most powerful military on Earth handed over an entire province of Vietnamese jungle to a force that never exceeded 300 men from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why the Viet Cong stopped calling them soldiers. They called them something else. Ma Rang, the jungle ghosts. Stay with me. In the spring of 1966, American military planners faced a problem that no amount of firepower could solve. Phuoc Tuy Province. 104,000 people spread across roughly 1,000 square miles of some of the most hostile terrain in South Vietnam. Mountains covered in triple canopy jungle. Rubber plantations with visibility measured in meters, not kilometers. Villages that changed allegiance with the setting sun. And underneath it all, a tunnel network so extensive that entire battalions could disappear underground and emerge weeks later 30 kilometers away. The province sat southeast of Saigon, dominating the approaches to Vonga, a deep water port of strategic importance. Route 15 ran through it, the main supply artery feeding the capital. In theory, whoever controlled Phuoc Tuy controlled access to Saigon. In practice, by 1966, the Viet Cong controlled everything except the provincial capital of Baja and the port itself. Everything else belonged to the enemy. The numbers told the story American commanders didn't want to admit. Intelligence estimated approximately 5,000 communist troops operating in the province. 2 main force regiments, the 274th and 275th, backed by the D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion. These weren't irregular guerrillas hiding in the jungle. These were professional soldiers, many with decades of combat experience fighting the French, the Japanese, the French again, and now the Americans. They had built an entire parallel government, tax collection systems, political committees reaching into every village and hamlet, infrastructure that functioned better than anything the Saigon regime had managed to establish. American forces had tried. God knows they had tried. The 123rd Airborne Brigade, some of the finest paratroopers in the world, had conducted operations in Phuoc Tuy since 1965. They brought helicopter mobility. They brought artillery support. They brought the same tactics that were working everywhere else in Vietnam. Search and destroy. Overwhelming firepower, body counts, the American way of war, and they were being slaughtered. May 1966, Operation Hardihood. The 173rd moved to secure an area around a feature called mentioning.What, a small hill in the center of the province where someone had decided to build a new base. It should have been routine. 2 battalions of elite paratroopers clearing a security zone. American casualties, 23 killed, 160 wounded. And those were just the ones they could count. But there were others. The ones who didn't make it into the official tallies. The paratroopers who walked into the jungle during routine patrols and simply never came back. No firefight, no bodies, no evidence. They entered the green and vanished, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Search teams would find the trail where the patrol had been walking, and then nothing. No blood, no brass, no signs of struggle. The jungle had taken them and left no trace. 47 men went into one operation. 19 came out. The official report called it enemy action in complex terrain. The classified assessment, the one that only reached senior intelligence officers, told a different story. The Viet Cong hadn't fought these men. They had hunted them systematically, patiently, one by one, pulling soldiers from patrol lines without firing a shot. This was the moment when someone at MACV headquarters made a decision that would never be publicly acknowledged. The long high mountains, a 14-kilometer massif of limestone ridges and jungle, were declared off-limits to American ground forces. The area was labeled a free fire zone for airstrikes, but no American infantry would be sent in. The Viet Cong D445 battalion operated from those mountains with apparent impunity, launching attacks throughout the province and then melting back into terrain. The Americans couldn't follow, but someone had to deal with them. Someone had to control Phuoc Tuy. The province couldn't be left as a Viet Cong sanctuary 40 kilometers from Saigon. The strategic importance was too great. The political embarrassment was too severe. Enter the Australians. In April 1966, the first elements of the 1st Australian Task Force began arriving at Vung Tau. By June, they had established a base at New Dat Viet Cong territory. Their initial strength, 2 infantry battalions, 1 SAS squadron, supporting artillery, armored personnel, carriers, engineers. On paper, roughly 500 men. Eventually, the force would grow to about 300 when naval and air elements were included. To put this in perspective, the Americans had over 500 Dirozuzaren troops in Vietnam by 1968. The Australians never had more than 8,000 Zarans in country at any one time. They were a rounding error in the overall Allied order of battle. A footnote, a minor contribution from a minor ally. And they were about to do what 500,000 Americans could not. But understanding how requires going back to 1948, back to the jungles of Malaya, where Australian soldiers had learned lessons that American doctrine had never contemplated. The Malayan emergency lasted 12 years. Communist insurgents attempting to overthrow British colonial rule through guerrilla warfare in terrain almost identical to Vietnam. Triple canopy jungle villages that supported the insurgents during the day, and government forces at night, or vice versa, depending on who was watching. An enemy who could disappear into the population or the jungle at will. The British, with Australian and New Zealand support, had developed an approach called counterinsurgency. Not big unit sweeps, not search and destroy, not overwhelming firepower. Instead, patient methodical work to separate insurgents from their popular support. Small unit patrols, long-range reconnaissance, ambushes set and held for days at a time. Above all, slow, deliberate operations designed to gather intelligence and deny the enemy freedom of movement. Australian officers who fought in Malaya had learned that conventional warfare tactics didn't work against guerrillas. You couldn't win by killing the enemy faster than they could recruit. You couldn't win by destroying villages because destroying villages created more insurgents. You couldn't win through firepower because guerrillas simply avoided areas where firepower could be effectively employed. You won by making the insurgents invisible to their own supporters. You won by denying them access to food, recruits, intelligence. You won by being better at jungle warfare than they were. You won by becoming the hunters instead of the hunted. When the 1st Australian Task Force arrived in Phuoc Tuy, they brought this philosophy with them, and immediately they began operating in ways that baffled and frustrated American commanders. General William Westmoreland, commander of MACV, reportedly complained that the Australians were not being aggressive enough. American doctrine measured success in body counts. How many enemy killed? The Australians barely tracked such statistics. American operations moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. Australian patrols sometimes covered less than 1 kilometer in an entire day. Americans cleared jungle with defoliants and artillery. Australians walked through it without disturbing a leaf. American journalist Gerald Stone observed Australian operations in 1966 and described what he saw. Australian patrols shunned jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way carefully and quietly through bamboo thicket and tangled foliage. They moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, then proceeded again. Some patrols took 9 hours to sweep a mile of terrain. To American commanders raised on the doctrine of speed and violence of action, this looked like cowardice or incompetence or both. To the Viet Cong, it looked like something they had never encountered before. The Australian approach began with the smallest tactical unit, the rifle section. In American doctrine, a squad was part of a platoon, which was part of a company, which was part of a battalion. Higher headquarters controlled the battle through radio communications and detailed orders. Initiative at the squad level was limited. Australian sections operated with far more autonomy. A corporal commanding 8 or 9 men could make tactical decisions without requesting permission from company headquarters. Patrol routes weren't prescribed from above. Fire support wasn't pre-planned according to rigid templates. Section commanders were trained to think independently, to make decisions based on what they observed, to adapt to circumstances that headquarters couldn't predict. This meant Australian patrols could move with a flexibility that American units lacked. If a trail looked suspicious, they avoided it without requesting permission. If they detected enemy presence, they could establish an ambush position and wait for days without checking in every hour. If the tactical situation demanded silence, they could maintain radio silence for extended periods. But flexibility was only part of the equation. The real difference lay in how Australian soldiers moved through the jungle. Americans patrolled, Australians hunted. The distinction sounds subtle, but the implications were profound. American patrols moved through terrain to accomplish an objective. Search an area, clear a village, locate enemy positions. They were reactive. When they made contact with the enemy, they responded with firepower, artillery, airstrikes, helicopter gunships. Maximum violence applied to suppress the enemy and allow friendly forces to maneuver or withdraw. Australian patrols hunted. They entered the jungle not to search, but to kill. They moved with the patience of predators, spending hours in absolute stillness, watching, listening, analyzing every sight and sound. When they made contact, it was almost always because they had chosen to. They had found the enemy first. They had positioned themselves for ambush. They had controlled the terms of engagement from the beginning. This required a completely different mindset. American soldiers were trained to be aggressive, decisive, to meet violence with greater violence. These were admirable qualities in conventional warfare where speed and momentum could shatter enemy formations. In the jungle, aggression got you killed, speed got you ambushed. Decisiveness without information meant walking into traps. The Viet Cong had spent years studying American tactics. They knew Americans moved quickly. They knew Americans made noise. They knew Americans relied on firepower to compensate for tactical disadvantages. They had developed counters to all of it. Stay silent and low during artillery barges. Disappear before airstrikes arrive. Ambush American patrols on trails where the thick vegetation prevented effective use of supporting fires. Against the Australians, none of this worked. Australian SAS patrols moved at 100 to 200 mm per hour through jungle terrain. Not 100 to 200 mm every hour, but an average that included periods of complete stillness lasting 15 or 20 minutes between movements. The point man would take a single step, placing his foot with surgical precision on ground that wouldn't compress or make noise. Then the entire patrol would freeze for 4, 5, sometimes 10 minutes. They would remain absolutely motionless, using only their eyes to scan their surroundings, testing the air with subtle movements of the nostrils, listening with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. American observers who witnessed this found it maddening. How could anyone accomplish anything moving that slowly? How could you cover your area of operations at a pace that made a snail look fast? The Australians understood something Americans didn't. In triple canopy jungle, the side that moved fast was the side that got detected first, and the side that got detected first usually lost. At 100 mph, an Australian patrol created almost no disturbance. The jungle's natural sounds recovered completely between movements. Birds continued singing. Insects kept droning. There was nothing for enemy listening posts to detect. No snapping branches, no rustling leaves, no vibrations transmitted through root systems. From an acoustic perspective, the patrol didn't exist. But moving slowly provided more than concealment. It transformed the Australians from prey into apex predators. A Viet Cong patrol, moving at normal speed, even cautiously, created subtle disturbances. Experienced Australian soldiers, who had spent hours in absolute stillness, could detect these disturbances from extraordinary distances. The faint rustle of equipment brushing against vegetation. The almost imperceptible change in insect sounds as someone passed. The slight movement of foliage that didn't match wind patterns. Australian patrols detected enemy movement long before being detected themselves. This meant they could establish ambush positions on paths the enemy intended to use. They could count enemy forces and assess their armament. They could call in artillery strikes with precision because they could see exactly where targets were located. They could choose whether to engage or simply observe, gathering intelligence without compromising their position. The psychological impact on the Viet Cong was devastating. Capture documents from late 1968 revealed that the enemy had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. For Americans, the guidance emphasized predictability. Americans used helicopter insertions, moved at trackable speeds, could be smelled from 500 meters away because of their hygiene products. Recommended approach: aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations, inflict maximum casualties in the first 30 seconds, withdraw before artillery becomes effective. For Australians, the guidance was radically different. Australian patrols were extremely difficult to detect. They couldn't be smelled because they eliminated chemical signatures. They couldn't be heard because they moved too slowly to create sound. They couldn't be tracked because their counter-tracking techniques made following them nearly impossible. Recommended approach: avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush because Australians were more likely to detect the trap than walk into it. If contact unavoidable, break it off and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols weren't operating. The documents used a specific term for Australian soldiers that was applied to no other Allied force: Maang, jungle ghosts. The term carried supernatural connotations that exceeded ordinary military respect. The Viet Cong weren't merely cautious about Australian forces. They were afraid in ways they were never afraid of Americans. This fear had measurable tactical consequences. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did enter, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. But psychology alone didn't pacify Phuoc Tuy. The Australians had to do the grinding, dangerous work of counterinsurgency, and this is where their methods became truly innovative. American operations in Vietnam typically involved large formations, company or battalion-sized sweeps through areas suspected of harboring enemy forces. The theory was that large formations could defend themselves against ambush and bring overwhelming firepower to bear when they made contact. The reality was that large formations were easy to detect and avoid. The Viet Cong had observation posts covering all major routes. They could track American movements from kilometers away and simply disappear before contact occurred. When they chose to fight, It was almost always from positions they had prepared in advance, against targets they had selected. Australian operations emphasized small unit actions. A typical patrol might be 5 men, sometimes as few as 4 in SAS operations. These tiny teams would insert into enemy territory, often walking in from the edge of cleared areas rather than using helicopters. They would establish patrol bases in concealed locations and operate from there for days or weeks. 5 men moving properly through jungle terrain were effectively invisible. They could penetrate deep into enemy-controlled areas, observe supply routes, identify base camps, track enemy movements. When they found targets of opportunity, they could call in artillery or airstrikes with precision because they could see exactly what they were hitting. But the real power of small unit operations wasn't the patrols themselves. It was what happened when multiple patrols saturated an area. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS squadrons conducted 175 patrols in and around Phuoc Toi province. Not all at once, of course. At any given time, there might be 6 to 8 patrols deployed, each covering a specific area. But over months and years, this created a cumulative intelligence picture that no other Allied force in Vietnam achieved. The SAS operated in 5-man patrols. 4 riflemen and a patrol commander. Each man carried roughly 80 pounds of equipment, weapons, ammunition, radio, food for 7 to 14 days, water, survival gear, no resupply, no external support except artillery and helicopter extraction in emergencies. Once inserted, a patrol was on its own. Insertions were carefully planned to avoid detection. Sometimes patrols would insert by helicopter at last light, several kilometers from their actual target area, then walk through the night to reach their patrol base. Other times they would insert during the day, but into an area away from known enemy activity, establishing a baseline of normally before moving toward the target. The goal was always the same: get into position without the enemy knowing you were there. A typical reconnaissance patrol might spend 3 days just moving to the target area. At 100 to 200 miles per hour, covering even 5 kilometers could take 2 full days of movement. Once in position, the patrol would establish an observation post, usually on high ground overlooking a trail or suspected enemy position. And then they would wait hours, days, sometimes a week or more. 5 men sitting in absolute silence, watching a trail junction or a suspected base camp, documenting every movement, every pattern, every detail that might be tactically useful. When enemy patrols passed within meters, the Australians remained frozen. When enemy soldiers stopped to rest literally feet away, the SAS troopers didn't move, didn't breathe visibly, didn't create any indication of their presence. The intelligence they gathered was extraordinary, not just numbers and locations, but patterns. The Viet Cong moved supplies on certain trails on certain days. Rest periods occurred at specific times. Patrol routes followed predictable patterns based on terrain and previous contacts with Allied forces. A 5-man SAS patrol, watching for a week, could map out enemy activity in an area better than aerial reconnaissance could accomplish in a month. But reconnaissance was only half the mission. The other half was ambush. When a target of opportunity presented itself, usually a small enemy patrol moving along a trail, the SAS would strike with devastating precision. The ambush would be initiated by claymore mines, positioned to cover the killing zone, initiated by the patrol commander when the maximum number of enemy soldiers were in the optimal position. The claymores would detonate, followed immediately by rifle fire at ranges of 20 to 30 meters. Total engagement time, 5 to 10 seconds, then silence. The Australians wouldn't pursue, wouldn't search the bodies, wouldn't waste time confirming kills. They had already called in artillery to seal potential enemy reinforcement routes. Within minutes of the ambush, they would be moving away from the contact point, using pre-planned withdrawal routes that avoided obvious escape paths. By the time enemy reinforcements arrived, the SAS patrol had vanished, leaving only casualties and the growing reputation of the jungle ghosts. This pattern repeated hundreds of times between 1966 and 1971. Small patrols, patient reconnaissance, sudden violence, immediate withdrawal. Each patrol gathered intelligence. Each ambush reduced enemy capability by a few soldiers, a few weapons, a small amount of supplies. Individually, these actions seemed almost trivial. Collectively, they created a situation where the Viet Cong could not move freely in their own territory. The Australians knew where the Viet Cong moved. They knew which trails were used regularly, and which were decoys. They knew where base camps were located, how large they were, how well defended. They knew where supply caches were hidden. They knew the patrol patterns of enemy units, their radio frequencies, their commanders' names and habits. This intelligence allowed for surgical operations that American sweeps could never accomplish. In December 1969, Australian and New Zealand forces mounted Operation Laverack in western Puak Tui province. The operation targeted the Mau Tau Mountains, a Viet Cong stronghold that had resisted American efforts to pacify it. Instead of a massive sweep, the Australians deployed rifle companies to blocking positions on all enemy routes throughout the region. These weren't random positions. They were based on weeks of reconnaissance by SAS patrols that had identified exactly where enemy forces moved and when. For 32 days, Australian forces maintained these positions, ambushing Viet Cong patrols, interdicting supply routes, destroying base camps. By the end of the operation, they had defeated 2 main force regiments, captured and destroyed hundreds of enemy bunkers, disrupted the Viet Cong administrative system, and irreparably damaged the enemy's military and political position in Puak Tui. A senior military historian would later describe Operation Laverack as spectacularly effective. Yet outside Australia, almost nobody has heard of it. This was the pattern throughout the Australian deployment in Vietnam. Quiet professional work that produced results far exceeding the force size. No dramatic headlines, no famous battles that captured public imagination the way Drang or Kesan did for Americans. Just methodical dismantling of enemy capability in their assigned province. The numbers tell the story. Between 1966 and 1971, the 1st Australian Task Force recorded at least 370 enemy killed in Phuoc Tuy province. Australian casualties, 478 killed, 25 wounded over the entire course of the war, across all units and services, not just in Phuoc Tuy. The Australian SIS specifically achieved kill ratios that exceeded 30-1 in some operations. Their losses: 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded during their entire Vietnam deployment. For comparison, American units conducting identical missions in adjacent sectors averaged kill ratios of approximately 1 to 12. Some operations resulted in ratios closer to 1:1. What created this massive disparity training was part of it. Australian soldiers, particularly SAS, underwent longer and more rigorous preparation than their American counterparts. Selection alone weeded out candidates who lacked the temperament for patient, independent operations. Those who passed entered training programs that emphasized fieldcraft, navigation, tracking, and small unit tactics far more than American programs did. But training alone doesn't explain kill ratios of 30-1. Plenty of well-trained forces have been defeated by less trained but more tactically flexible opponents. The real difference was philosophical. Australian military culture had spent a century operating on the margins of empire, fighting small wars where victory couldn't be achieved through simple application of superior firepower: the Boer War, the Malayan emergency, the Indonesian confrontation. In each of these conflicts, Australian forces learned that patience, fieldcraft, and psychological manipulation could achieve results that artillery barges could not. American military culture was built on fundamentally different assumptions. American doctrine emphasized action over patience, speed over stealth, technology over adaptation, overwhelming force over economy of effort. These weren't wrong principles. They had won World War II and held the line in Korea. They made America the dominant military power on Earth. But in the jungles of Southeast Asia against an enemy who had spent decades perfecting the art of guerrilla warfare, they produced catastrophic results. The tragedy was that lessons were available for learning. The Australians shared information freely with American counterparts. Individual Americans recognized the value of Australian methods and advocated adoption. The evidence was overwhelming and accessible to anyone willing to examine it. But institutions don't change because evidence demands change. They change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. For the American military in Vietnam, the cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic event that might have forced immediate reform. Each ambush was a separate incident. Each patrol that walked into a trap was an individual failure that could be attributed to specific circumstances rather than systematic flaws. The pattern was visible only in aggregate statistics that senior commanders had professional reasons not to examine closely. Yet there were moments when the differences between Australian and American methods became too obvious to ignore. August 18, 1966, the Battle of Long Ten. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, departed their base at Nuatat to locate enemy firing positions and track their withdrawal. They were following signs of a Viet Cong force that had mortared the Australian base 2 nights earlier. Standard patrol mission. Nothing unusual expected. At approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, 11 platoon made contact with a small group of enemy soldiers in a rubber plantation. The Viet Cong withdrew. 11 platoon pursued, and suddenly everything went wrong. The small group had been bait. D Company walked into a force estimated between 1,500 and 2,500 troops. Elements of the 275th Viet Cong Regiment, at least one North Vietnamese battalion, the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion against 108 Australians. For the next 4 hours, D Company fought for survival. Monsoon rain turned the battlefield to mud. Visibility dropped to meters. Radio communications became unreliable as rain interfered with signals. The Viet Cong attacked in waves, attempting to flank and isolate the Australians, using the rubber trees for cover while unleashing intense rifle and machine gun fire. The Australian artillery at Nui Dat, 5 kilometers away, fired mission after mission, breaking up enemy formations before they could overrun the Australian positions. Our AAF helicopters flew through the storm at treetop level, dropping ammunition directly onto D Company's position, despite the danger of ground fire. Just as ammunition was running critically low and the situation looked hopeless, B Company arrived with armored personnel carriers breaking through the enemy cordon. By the time the battle ended, 18 Australians were dead and 24 wounded. More than 1/3 of D Company's strength, the highest number of Australian casualties in any single engagement of the Vietnam War. But the enemy left behind 245 confirmed dead on the battlefield, with evidence of many more casualties dragged away during the fighting. Blood trails, drag marks, captured documents would later suggest DE Company faced approximately 500 enemy troops, with at least one, Siu Zenran, in direct contact. Long Ten became Australia's defining battle in Vietnam. Proof that small, well-trained forces could prevail against overwhelming odds when properly supported. But it also highlighted something American observers found difficult to accept. DC Company had walked into that ambush the same way American companies walked into ambushes across Vietnam, following an enemy force without adequate reconnaissance of the terrain ahead, moving at speeds that precluded careful observation, assuming that superior firepower would compensate for tactical disadvantages. The Australians survived because their artillery was accurate and responsive, because their helicopter pilots were willing to fly in conditions that grounded American aircraft, and because reinforcements arrived at exactly the right moment. But they had made fundamental mistakes that Australian doctrine was supposed to prevent. The artillery support that saved D Company